Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time, your interest, and support. And with that, I will pass the floor to Nathaniel.
Thank you, Ren. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who are spending your evening with us. Holy moly, we've got a lot of people already online. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. That was Ren Siniza, and we also have Peter Polga-Hekimovich on helping answer questions in the Q&A folder. We have a lot to get to tonight. And just to show you how much we've got to get to tonight, I'm going to share my screen here. And we always like to do this, let you know what's coming. I'm going to very briefly give you a quick overview of the Environmental Voter Project's work, because I know that some of you are new to EVP. But please forgive us if you think, oh my gosh, why'd you go so quickly? That's by design. This is not meant to be an introduction to the Environmental Voter Project webinar. And don't worry, we do have one of those coming up. What we're going to spend almost all of our time on tonight is item number 2 that you see here. And that is a state-by-state analysis of the 19 states that we work in to let all of you, our volunteers, our donors, our supporters, know how many mobilization targets we've identified in each of our states for this year, what some of the really good opportunities are to mobilize them, and what the political stakes are in those states. At the end of that, we're going to go over the ways that you can get involved and be a part of this work. The general election on November 5th is now only 9.5 months away. It's time to get in the game. Then, if you would like to leave us, please go ahead. That will pretty much take the entire hour. But if you want to stick around afterwards, we will have an optional Q&A session, and we would love to have you join us. But as Ren mentioned, if you have questions while you're here on this webinar, please put them in the Q&A folder. Someone will either answer them for you, or they will hold on to them and ask them of me during the optional Q&A session. All right. The numbers are still ticking up. We've got a great audience, but let's go ahead and jump into things and start with this overview of the Environmental Voter Project's work. Very simply, what the Environmental Voter Project does is we're a nonpartisan nonprofit that identifies people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet don't vote, and then we turn them into better, more consistent voters. Now, what that means is we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. We are not in the mind-changing business. We are not in the opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we want to do with the Environmental Voter Project is bypass the hard, messy, expensive stuff of politics, which is changing people's opinions, and instead identify the people who don't need their opinions changed. We want to identify the people who are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists, and it's their #1 priority, yet they're not voting. And so what they need is a behavioral intervention. Not that changing people's voting behavior is easy, of course it isn't. But it is easier than changing minds, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper. And so this is what we choose to focus on. And for better or for worse, you'll come to see that just in our 19 states alone this year, we are targeting 4.8 million of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists. That is a huge pool of potential political power. Now, before we get into that, how do we go about doing this? Well, it's a 4-step process. And again, forgive me for breezing through this, but you're here to get some data, not learn about how we do what we do. First, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models to individually identify super environmentalists on the voter file. Very briefly, what this means is we will poll tens of thousands of people, isolate the ones who tell us climate is their #1 priority, then find out as much information we can about them, and then try to extrapolate out and find other people like them in their states. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we're able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single voter in a state voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their #1 priority. Once we've done that, we only focus on the ones who need our help. There are a whole bunch of environmentalists who already vote. We don't want to give them a behavioral intervention. Instead, we focus on the ones who, looking at their public voting history, are unlikely to vote. That's step 2, mobilization. We work with thousands of volunteers to canvass, call, and postcard these voters. We also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns, all using tested behavioral science informed messaging that our randomized control trials have proven increase turnout. Step 3, habit reinforcement. You don't need to be like us. You don't need to know a lot of the behavioral science behind voting to understand that if you want to change someone's voting habits, you can't just talk to them every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. And so we take this third step very seriously, habit reinforcement. We work in odd years and even years, in special elections and local elections. We will mobilize environmentalists in dog catcher and library trustee races, not because they mean a lot for environmental policymaking, but because they mean everything if you're trying for long-term behavior change. If you're trying to change people's habits, well, then every election becomes a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. And that leads us to the 4th step, because ultimately what we are trying to do with the Environmental Voter Project is not just impact particular elections, but rather change the electorate overall. What we are trying to do is dramatically increase the number of climate-first voters who show up and vote in every election, because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so they always end up going where the votes are. And so if we can dramatically increase the number of environmentalists and voters who are demanding climate action, that's always going to help our broader cause, whether we're looking at a Democratic primary or a Republican primary or a general election. Politicians are going to do what it takes to win. So we need to make it really hard for them to win without leading on climate. Very briefly, just looking at the last 4 years, our randomized control trials have shown that we are solely responsible, while controlling for all outside variables, for increasing turnout as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5 percentage points in local elections. And this is just through the halfway point of last year. So just 3.5 years you're looking at here. Now, we've been active in over 1,000 elections in the last 4 years, and we've probably increased turnout in most of them. But these are elections where we can prove with statistical certainty that we were solely responsible for increasing that turnout. Over the long term, we have now contacted over 9.5 million of these low propensity climate first voters, all of whom, by definition, were unlikely to vote in a particular election, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them. And what we can see in voter files, as of this time almost a year ago, almost 1.5 million of them have now become such consistent voters that they voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They have become super voters. This is the second metric that we track. Now, to be clear, this is not like the previous metric, randomized control trials. I cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. But we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization that over the last 7 years has been involved in close to 2,000 elections, mobilizing these non-voters to become better voters. All right, I told you we would only spend a few minutes going over what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, but I know that many of you are new to us. You might have questions about a whole bunch of the stuff that I just said. If so, first in the chat, you'll see links to what's called mini briefings that we prepare on our YouTube channel that can teach you about various aspects of our work. But second, for anybody who is new to the Environmental Voter Project and wants to learn more, I encourage you to attend our briefing on February 8th. This will be an introductory briefing where we go into detail on all of the things that I just breezed over because we want to get to the meat of this evening's webinar. All right. Without further ado, I want to remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. They'll either be answered or we'll save them for the Q&A session at the end. Let's jump into our 19 states, folks. And oh my gosh, we have such an amazing attendance here tonight. It's so great to welcome all of you. We are going to be talking about these 19 states. These are the 19 states that the Environmental Voter Project is active in, because these are the states in which we have identified disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists. These are the states where we feel we can make the most difference. Does that mean that they are the only politically important states? No, of course not. There are a whole bunch of politically important states that aren't colored in green there. Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, tons of them, tons of them. But a lot of those states don't have lots of non-voting environmentalists. So no matter how good we are, we won't make an impact. These are the states where we feel we can have an extraordinary impact. And over the next 9.5 months, we will be targeting 4.8 million super environmentalists who are already registered to vote. They are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their #1 priority. Yet, if you look at their public voting history, they didn't vote in any of the elections over the last 4 years. So they didn't vote in the most recent presidential or any other election leading up to it. So we think they're unlikely to vote without getting a really robust mobilization campaign to move them to the polls. And I'm going to go through these 19 states in alphabetical order, let you know what we're seeing, what we've got coming for you, our volunteers and donors, and some opportunities. Alaska, that's what we're starting with. We have identified close to 30,000 already registered super environmentalists in Alaska who are unlikely to vote. These will be our targets over the next 9.5 months. What does that mean in a state like Alaska? Well, you can see we've put some contextual numbers here. 360,000 ballots were cast in the 2020 general election in Alaska. So this is about 8 or 9% of all of the entire ballots cast 4 years ago. The margin in that last presidential election was only 36,000 votes. What's going on in Alaska? Well, the at-large congressional seat is very, very close. Mary Peltola, a Democrat, is defending her seat. And the state Senate in Alaska is very, very close. And you'll see in a lot of our slides here, we're not just talking about November 5th as an opportunity to reach these voters. In Alaska, they've got a presidential primary coming up. They've got a municipal election in Anchorage coming up. Both of those are in April. Then in August, they have their state primary. In November, they have their general. All 4 of those moments in time, not to mention a lot of special elections that might come up, are precious opportunities for us to talk to these voters. Now, who are these 29,000 who we'll be targeting? I want you to look at this block of data down at the bottom. I'll explain what these dashes are in a second, don't worry. But first, I want to talk about reg voters and LPEVs. This data that you see at the bottom, that's what the demographic breakdown is of all registered voters in Alaska. So you'll see 51.2% of registered voters in Alaska are male, 48.8% female. LPEVs, that stands for low propensity environmental voters. These are the people we are targeting. And rather than just give you the demographic breakdown of our targets in each state, we wanted to provide a baseline. We wanted to also tell you what the demographic breakdown is of all registered voters in that state. Now, Alaska is unique among almost all of the states we'll be talking about in that we couldn't fill in all of this data. because they don't make a lot of the age data publicly available. We can find some of it through private data vendors, but not enough of it that we thought it would be instructive or precise to include it here. So that's why this age data isn't included. But you'll see our target population in Alaska is it skews slightly towards women. Alaska is a unique state where if you look at all registered voters, there are actually more men than women. That is very, very, very rare. But in our target population, that's split. That's flipped a little bit. And there is a gender gap. And in most states, you'll see, we see that women are much, much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment than men are. And just to let you know, when I use the terminology women or men or female or male, we are using the terminology that is in voter files, which is sex data collected by states. It is not gender data, and we're just going to be using the terminology that we find in voter files. You'll also see that our target population is disproportionately made up of people of color compared to the overall electorate in Alaska. And we have almost 3 times as many, or I guess the more precise way to put it is Native Americans are almost 3 times as prevalent in our target population as they are in the overall electorate in Alaska. All right, now we have this baseline template. I just want to go through one number that I'd like you to remember about Alaska, and then we'll spend a little bit less time on all of the next states now that you sort of know what's coming. The big number that I think is an important takeaway in Alaska is that at-large congressional district that Mary Peltola has. When we go back to when she won that in 2022, she won it by only a margin of 5,240 votes. So we're not used to Alaska being close in presidential elections, but it likely will be close for this congressional, not just because they have instant runoff voting there. All right, Arizona. Big, big, big battleground state, and not just because of the presidential. There's also a really important U.S. Senate race going on. There are 2 competitive congressional districts, and the state Senate and state House of Representatives in Arizona are as close can be. Arizona is going to be a crucially important state up and down the ballot. We at the Environmental Voter Project will be targeting almost 230,000 of these already registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote unless we give them a really robust, sophisticated mobilization campaign. Arizona's got a March presidential primary. They have some local special elections in March. They have their state primary in August, and then the general in November. If you look at our target universe, surprise, surprise, they're overwhelmingly young. That is something you are going to notice in all of our states. People who list climate and the environment as their top priority and are unlikely to vote are disproportionately young. You'll also see that not all of the sex data is available, so a lot of it is unknown. And then when we look at the demographic breakdown of these voters, you'll notice that, again, our target population is disproportionately made up of people of color. It especially trends Hispanic, AAPI, and Native American. The one number to remember, this. 10,457 was the margin that Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by in the 2020 presidential. Really, really small number. When you divide our target population, 229,000, by that small number, you realize that our targets, who we will be mobilizing at EVP, that population is so large that it's almost 22 times larger than the margin of victory in Arizona in 2020. Arizona is crucially important. All right, Colorado. We're going to be targeting 212,000 voters. There are currently 2 competitive congressional districts. The 3rd, which is where Lauren Boebert moved out of, she went to the 4th, and also the 8th, which is a dead even election there, or dead even district. Our population is overwhelmingly young. our population is slightly more male than female. We almost never see this. We almost never see this. It's obviously not an enormous margin, but it's interesting because we almost never see it. You'll see that also in Colorado, our target population trends Black, Hispanic, AAPI. When you look at that 8th congressional district that I mentioned, we've identified 22,475 targets just in that congressional district. And you'll see in parentheses, it says even next to it. What that means is the Cook Political Reports Partisan Voter Index, I know I just said a mouthful, says that it's even. Now, what does that mean? It means that if nationwide, over the past 4 federal elections, there is an election where Democrats win by 2 points, well, this district will probably have Democrats win by 2 points. If nationwide there's an election where Republicans win by 1 point, in this district, Republicans will likely win by 1 point. So this district, Colorado 8th, doesn't lean Democrat or Republican. It is right there in the middle. It's a super competitive district, one of the most competitive districts in the country. All right, Florida. We've identified a whopping 642,000 targets in Florida. That's almost twice the margin in 2020. You'll see, obviously, Florida is competitive for president and US Senate, a little bit less competitive than it's been in the past, but it's still competitive, and there are likely 5 competitive congressional districts. You'll see there are a lot of elections coming up. There actually was a special election just last night, House District 35, where the Democrat flipped a seat, won by 580 votes, I believe. We were mobilizing over 7,000 voters. And congratulations to all of the volunteers who are on the line now. We are not a partisan organization, but boy, is it nice to make a difference in such close elections. You'll see there are a lot of other elections coming up in March and April. There are tons of local elections in Florida. A few things just to notice about our target population in Florida. It is less Hispanic than the overall electorate. Just like many of you are likely reading, especially in southern Florida, Hispanic voters are trending more and more conservative. We are seeing that in our data as well. 2 and 4 years ago, our target populations in Florida were more Hispanic than the other underlying electorate. We're no longer seeing that. Now, it's not an enormous difference you'll see there, but when you compare it to a lot of our other states where our target population is more Hispanic than the baseline, it's something worth noting. On the other hand, we are seeing tons of targets appear in Jacksonville. And that's part of the reason why you'll see that that Black voters are more than twice as prevalent in our target population as they are in the underlying electorate. You'll also see that our target population trends AAPI as well, Asian American and Pacific Islander. One of the close districts, Jared Moskowitz's district, the 23rd, which is a D+5. That means it trends, it leans 5 points Democratic, but still is a very, very close seat. We've identified almost over 23,000 targets in that race. Georgia. This is one of the states where the Environmental Voter Project could make the biggest difference in 2024. We have individually identified almost 500,000 of these low propensity super environmentalists in Georgia. That is just a huge, huge number. It's almost 10%. It would equal almost 10% of all ballots that were cast 4 years ago in Georgia. It's huge. Now, for the first time in what seems like a generation, Georgia will not have a U.S. Senate race going on, nor do they have a gubernatorial, but it will be crucially important for president. They will also have Public Service Commission seats. So this is the regulatory body that oversees utilities in Georgia. They have their presidential primary, they have state primary, they have their general election. When we look at the demographic breakdown of our target population in Georgia, look at that. Disproportionately Black, disproportionately AAPI, and disproportionately Native American. If you look at all registered voters in Georgia, white voters outnumber Black voters almost 2-1. If you look at our target population, it's almost flipped, with Black voters almost outnumbering white voters 2-1. And obviously, very, very young. We're getting up to like almost over 85% of our target population in Georgia is below the age of 35. If you want to think of who we're targeting in Georgia, these are young Black women, young AAPI women. And the number to remember, our target population is so big that it's almost 42 times as large as Joe Biden's margin of victory was in Georgia 3.5 years ago. Okay, Iowa. We're going to be targeting over 58,000 voters in Iowa. I won't go into too much detail here, but you will note there are 2 very competitive congressional districts in Iowa. Iowa is a very, very white state. Our target population is a little bit less white, but still really white. And you can see some of the trends here. Number to remember, in the really competitive first Iowa congressional district, which it leans 3 points Republican, we've identified almost over 17,000 targets. Again, these are races that will really, really matter in a really close House of Representatives. Kansas, we're going to be targeting many, many more in Kansas. Over 82,000 voters in Kansas. The 3rd congressional district, that's Sharice Davids's district. Super, super, super competitive. When we look at our target population in Kansas, pretty significant gender gap. So when you look at all registered voters in Kansas, they trend about 5 points female. Look at our target population, it's almost twice that much. Almost twice that much. And in Sharice Davids's district, a huge number of targets. Almost 26,000 targets. Louisiana. Louisiana is a state that, for better or for worse, I tend to think worse, it's always bad to ignore states, but for better or for worse, it's usually ignored in presidential years. As many of you likely know, there has been an ongoing series of battles over redistricting in Louisiana. Whereas currently, there are 0 competitive congressional districts in Louisiana, most people think that the new maps, based off the guidance from courts, will likely leave 2 competitive congressional districts, or at least 2 districts that are likely Democrat or likely Republican rather than just slam dunks. So we don't know what the maps look like yet. We might have a 5th and 6th congressional district in Louisiana that are competitive. These will be important races to pay attention to. Looking at our target population in Louisiana, similar to what we saw in Georgia, we pretty much flip the prevalence of white and Black voters. So among all registered voters in Louisiana, whites outnumber Blacks 2-1. In our target population, it's the opposite. One thing you will also note is, I know the numbers are small, but similar to Florida, Hispanics are underrepresented in our target population. It's just sort of an interesting thing to note in Louisiana. All right, in Maine, I think this is really important. I know many of you probably already know this, but for those of you who don't, forgive me for really pushing this. Maine and Nebraska are 2 states that award some of their electoral college votes for the winner of the entire state. So 2 for the winner of the entire state, and then individual electoral college votes for the presidential winner of each congressional district. Well, Maine's 2nd congressional district, that's the Northern Congressional District, represented by Jared Golden, a Democrat, is very, very tight. It's represented by a Democrat, but it's actually a lean 6 Republican district. Donald Trump won it last time. Now, it was a different map last time, very similar to the current map, but it was different. This will be a close congressional race, but the reason why I put president here as well is because the winner, the presidential winner of that 2nd congressional district in Maine that gets that 1 electoral college vote, not to make you sick to your stomach with anxiety or anything, but the election could come down to 1 electoral college vote. And so this is worth paying attention to. And we have over 27,000 targets in that district. You can see the demographic breakdowns here. One very interesting thing about Maine is, look at that. It's a lot older. Our target population in Maine is a lot older than we see in a lot of these other states. It still trends young. It still trends young, but there are a lot of older, especially retirees, who care deeply about climate and the environment in Maine. And yeah, many of them don't vote. All right, Massachusetts. I'm not going to spend much time in Massachusetts because the Environmental Voter Project is not going to spend much time in Massachusetts this year. Massachusetts is where we first launched our proof of concept many years ago. We like to stay there in case special elections pop up. Local elections, we like to run experiments there to test various messages. We'll pay attention to the election calendar. If important specials pop up, we'll be active in them. Otherwise, we'll run some messaging experiments there. And that's all I got to say about Massachusetts. All right, Nebraska. This is the other state that I mentioned. And again, it's the 2nd congressional district that is going to be really, really tight. So like Maine, Nebraska awards individual electoral college votes for its individual congressional districts. The 2nd congressional district, currently represented by Republican Don Bacon, is one of the most competitive, if not the most competitive, congressional districts in the entire country. It is even. There is no partisan lean whatsoever. In 2022, so the first election that was held in this newly drawn district, the margin was 5,800 votes. EVP has over 18,000 targets there. So yes, that will be an important congressional race, but Nebraska will also be important for the presidential election because of the 2nd congressional district's electoral college vote. I also want to bring to your attention that Nebraska has a significant number of publicly elected local public utility boards. There are a lot of utilities that are publicly owned, and the regulatory bodies consist of elected officials. Many of them have elections this year, and you better believe that an organization that is trying to build the political power of the climate and environmental movement is going to pay attention to all of those elections. We still don't know everybody who's going to be on the ballot. We still don't know which are going to be contested by whom and when, but pay close attention to this. This is very important for the climate and environmental movements. When you look at our target demographics of our population in Nebraska, again, disproportionately young, but a little less than we find in some other states. Also, look at that. There actually are not a lot of registered voters in Nebraska who identify as Native American, but in our target population, they are more than 5 times as prevalent as they are in the underlying baseline of registered voters. Nevada. Nevada is going to be hugely important. Hugely important. It is a presidential battleground. It is a U.S. Senate battleground. 3 out of their 4 congressional districts are super close. Las Vegas has an open mayoral election. They've got tons of elections coming up. They have their presidential primary. They have their state primaries. They have their general. One good way to think about Nevada, and we're going to talk about this again with New Hampshire, is anybody who pulls a ballot in Nevada, no matter where they live, chances are they're going to have at least 3, if not more, competitive elections that they're voting on. I don't care where they live. Any Nevadan who is pulling a ballot, they're going to go down that ballot, and almost all of their choices are going to be super important competitive elections. As volunteers and donors, bear that in mind. That means your volunteer hour goes further, your dollar goes further in states like this. When we look at the demographic breakdowns of the population we're targeting, you'll see, again, like a lot of these Western states, there is incomplete data to tell the sex breakdowns of our targets, but they are disproportionately young. They are disproportionately people of color, in particular, AAPI and Black. What number do I want you to remember about Nevada? 20. Because for the first time in a presidential election, well, I guess they did it a little bit. They did it just because of COVID in 2020. But with a new law now, all active voters will be mailed ballots. Those have to be mailed out at least 20 days before Election Day. Why is this important? Because this is a crucial battleground state that all of a sudden is not going to have a one-day election day. They are going to have a 3, in some counties, 4-week long election day. That is crucially important for those of us in the voter mobilization business. This provides an almost month-long window during which we can get people to vote, find out which of them did vote, take them out of our contact universes, and fine-tune and optimize our messaging just to the people who need it. Again, as volunteers and donors, look for opportunities like this. This is really, really important to find stuff like this because it means your time and money won't be wasted on people who already voted. And it means you can get these people early. You're not just trying to have it all show up on one day. Okay, New Hampshire is similar, not in that they're mailing people ballots. I wish New Hampshire would do that. But New Hampshire is similar to Nevada in that literally every single person who's going to vote in New Hampshire has an absurdly competitive ballot to vote on. It is a presidential battleground, perhaps less so than in recent years, but still a battleground. It is an open gubernatorial election that's going to be super close. Both of the congressional districts are super close, and the state Senate and state House are super close. Literally everything is close in New Hampshire. And so again, as a volunteer and as a donor, just realize every voter you contact, you could be impacting 5 different races. 5 different races. They obviously have their primary coming up in less than a week. They have their state primary very, very late in the game in September, and then their general in November. Similar to Alaska, they have incomplete age data, so we didn't want to give you sort of misleading data there. But you can see there's a big, big gender gap. When I say that, I mean sex gap. It's sex data in our target population. They are disproportionately female leaning. New Hampshire is one of the whitest states in the nation. Our target population is similarly pretty white. It is less white than the underlying baseline of registered voters, but you can see the breakdown here. What's the number I want you to remember? Look at how close their state House of Representatives is. 198 Republicans, 195 Democrats, 3 independents, 4 vacant. And yes, you're reading that right. There are 400 members of the state House of Representatives in New Hampshire. They like hand House of Representatives like tags out at I-93 when you cross the border. There are a lot of them, but it's super, super close. And so all of state government is up for grabs in New Hampshire. The governor, the state House of Representatives, the state Senate. We only have 13,500 targets, not as many as we do in other states, even other small states. A lot of environmentalists vote in New Hampshire, but we still think that's enough to make a significant difference. All right, New Mexico, almost 88,000 targets. You can see what the context is for that. They have 1 tight congressional district heading into the year, and we've got over 28,000 targets in that district. What I'll point out about the demographics of our target population in New Mexico is disproportionately Native American, disproportionately Hispanic. as you're seeing in all of these states, our target population almost consistently is disproportionately young and disproportionately people of color. But in some states, Hispanics are disproportionately represented in our target population, but not in other states, not in Florida, not in, I believe, Pennsylvania. A lot of the Puerto Rican community around Allentown and Reading and around there actually don't pop in our target population. And so we, like a lot of people, are trying to figure out the changing faces of how Hispanics interact in American politics. All right, New York. We have over 800,000 targets in New York. Currently, 3 out of the 4 congressional districts on Long Island are really competitive. 3 of the Hudson Valley districts are competitive. And then the district that sort of leans over in the like Syracuse and Utica is competitive. But these are all changing. The number I want you to remember for New York is a date. It's February 28th. So coming up in about a month and a half, the Redistricting Commission in New York is going to submit a new map. That doesn't mean that the legislature is going to take it. They might say no thanks. Then there's a long back and forth. We don't know how long this will take, but the gears are starting to move. New York will have a new congressional map. There will likely be still a significant number of competitive districts. And so New York, just like a year ago, New York may end up deciding control of the House of Representatives. It is absolutely worth paying attention to. Our target population in New York is, as in other states, disproportionately people of color, but not as dramatically as you'll see in these numbers. The only real dramatic difference that you'll see is our target population, or AAPI voters, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, are almost twice as prevalent in our target population. All right, thank you for hanging in there. We're almost getting to the end of all this state-by-state data. North Carolina, super important. Most people don't realize it was by raw vote tally, it was the 4th closest state in the 2020 presidential election. Closer than Pennsylvania. It's a very close state. It will be an important battleground for president. It'll be an important battleground for governor. The current Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, is term limited out. They have 1 competitive congressional district after the series of gerrymandering back and forth. But their state Senate and state House of Representatives is also important. Now, I don't want to imply that they are close. They are not. But what they are is currently Republicans can override a Democratic governor's veto in North Carolina. Regardless of who wins the new gubernatorial election there, it's always going to be really important to figure out whether legislatures can override gubernatorial vetoes. North Carolina has a combined presidential and state primary coming up on Super Tuesday, March 5th. They have potential runoffs for their state primaries on May 14th, and then obviously the general. Look at how overwhelmingly young our target population is in North Carolina. Over 90% of our target population in North Carolina is under the age of 35. Now, as you've seen in the previous states, all of our target populations are disproportionately young, but they're almost never that disproportionately young. I mean, look, less than 1% of our target population is between the ages of 50 and 64. This is a very, very young group of low propensity environmental voters. It is also, as you'll see, disproportionately Black, disproportionately Hispanic, to an extent that we don't see in most of the other states. It's twice as prevalent in our target population, Hispanics are, than in the underlying group of registered voters. And you'll see disproportionately AAPI as well. One thing that you may also see is in most of our states, our target population is disproportionately Native American. That's not the case in North Carolina. It's not the case in North Carolina. Obviously, these numbers aren't big, but the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina is fairly conservative. And so, unlike in a lot of states, in North Carolina, Native American voters, you're not always able to predict how they are going to vote and what issues they are going to care about. So just an interesting thing to point out there. Number to remember, our target population in North Carolina is big when compared to the underlying electorate. It's so big that it's 3.6 times the margin, Donald Trump's margin of victory in 2020 in North Carolina. All right. Pennsylvania. We're going to be targeting 245,000 voters in Pennsylvania. You can see the context there. I don't need to tell you guys that this is the, I think George Bush once called Florida the big enchilada because of so many electoral votes. Well, Pennsylvania, I think, is now the big enchilada. Like, this is it. This is it. This has more electoral college votes, 19, than any of the other sort of top tier swing states, the Michigans, the Wisconsins, the Arizonas, the Georgias, the North Carolinas. This is the big one. Not only is it close for president, but there's a U.S. Senate race. There are 5 competitive congressional districts, and the state Senate and state House of Representatives are also super close. So similar to Nevada, similar to New Hampshire, any voter whom you contact as a volunteer or any voter we contact using your donations, chances are when they pull that ballot, they're going to see 3, maybe 4 competitive races on their ballot. Super, super important. They have some February special elections coming up. April 23rd, they have their combined state and presidential primary, and then obviously they have their general. You can see that our target population in Pennsylvania is disproportionately AAPI and disproportionately Black. 2 more states. We're almost there, folks. Texas, over 710,000 targets in Texas. That's a lot. That's a lot. It's important for president. It's important for U.S. Senate. I'm not going to claim that Texas and Florida are as competitive as the North Carolinas and Georgias and Arizonas and Pennsylvanias. They're not. But Texas, at least, is getting more competitive each year. Similar to what we saw in North Carolina, look at how young our target population is there. Almost 50% of them are under the age of 25. 90% are under the age of 35. Also look at the gender gap in Texas. These low propensity environmental voters in Texas are disproportionately female. It's almost a 15-point gender gap in our target population. Whereas if you look at all registered voters in Texas, it's a 5-point gender gap. Our target population is slightly more Black than the underlying baseline of registered voters. It's significantly more AAPI, slightly more Hispanic. All right, our last state. You guys asked for the data in each state, and we're delivering it, okay? The last of the 19 states, Virginia, 321,000 target voters. This is some context for that. We've got 3 competitive congressional districts in Virginia. We've got their presidential primary coming up on Super Tuesday. Their state primary is on a different date. That's June 18th. And then obviously the general. Numbers to remember. In the 2nd congressional district, which is Jen Kiggins' district, we've got 22,000 targets. In Abigail Spanberger's district, she's not running for re-election because she's going to run for governor the year after this one, we've got over 19,000 targets. Virginia is going to have 3 close congressional races. And in a really, really close Congress, this could be a difference-making state. It absolutely could be. You'll see we've also got a pretty significant gender gap in our target population there. We also have a disproportionately Black target population. and a disproportionately AAPI target population. All right, 19 states. You guys asked for all this data, so don't blame us that you get all this data. 19 states. Thank you for sticking with us. Now we're going to get just very briefly into some of the opportunities and give you a sense of some of our budgets. We are looking to raise as much as $11.5 million in these 19 states. As you'll see, I just put up a few battleground states here to give you a sample of some of our budgets. You'll see ranges. That's because we don't assume that we're going to raise that much money. In fact, our minimum is we're working with what will likely end up being about a $3.7 million budget. But we can dramatically scale up. We can scale up so quickly. And so in a lot of these states, you'll see our minimum hoped for budget has us spending about $1.50 per target voter. But in many of these states, we feel like we can scale up to spending over $4 per voter without having any diminishing returns, by which I mean the, 2 millionth dollar we spend in Texas will likely create as many voters per dollar spent as the $500,000 we spend in Texas. We can spend that much without having a dramatic depreciation in return on investment. These are the numbers we're looking to raise and spend in various states. And yes, we do have this breakdown in all of our states for those of you who are curious. How you can get involved. First of all, volunteer. We have calling opportunities every single day. That's not hyperbole. Every single day. Now, if you look at the Get Involved page on our website, and there'll be a link in the chat, you won't see phone banks every day. We have phone banks usually 2 or 3 times a week. But once you've been on one of our phone banks and have been trained on how to do our unique style of calling and use our scripts and log in, well then, our organizing team will send you information so that you can call on your own whenever you want. And so yes, ever since we took January 1st off, and so did our volunteers, but ever since January 2nd this year, we have been calling voters every single day, and we're going to do that all the way through November 5th. So join us, sign up for one of those phone banks, get trained, and you can contact voters every single day from the comfort of your own couch. We are also canvassing in 3 places: Austin, Texas, Tucson, Arizona, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You can see the dates of those canvasses on our Get Involved page. We would love to have you join us if you're in one of those 3 cities. If you're not, but you know some people in those 3 cities, please connect us with them. Finally, we are having 4 to 6 postcarding campaigns. We haven't decided the precise number yet. We've already closed signups for our first postcarding campaign, which is for the March 5th Super Tuesday combined state presidential primary in North Carolina. We will be announcing more postcarding campaigns. Sign up on our email list at the Get Involved page so that you can be notified for it. And then the final thing I'll just say about volunteering is you guys outed yourselves. Like you're here for a reason, right? You outed yourselves. You are here because you care deeply about the future of our democracy. You care deeply about the climate crisis, and you want to make sure as many environmentalists show up at the polls as possible 9.5 months from now. You're here for a reason. And so I get it. Some of you might be thinking, oh, I don't like calling people on the phone. And I get it. I don't really like it either. What I'm asking you is if you're not sure, just give it a shot. Attend a training. The beginning of each of these phone banks starts with a training. Be trained, give it a shot. If after 5 or 10 minutes you don't like it, hang up. Don't do it. Stop. But you're here for a reason. Give it a shot. do yourself a favor and give it a shot, because I think you'll come to realize that it's a lot easier than you think. We've got thousands of volunteers who like to call with us. We have randomized control trials proving that it increases turnout. And I'll say it again, you're here for a reason. Go to that Get Involved link, sign up. The second thing, donate. I am not ashamed to ask for donations for this nonprofit. We have already individually identified 4.8 million registered to vote super environmentalists who are unlikely to show up without proven voter turnout techniques. 2, we have the proven voter turnout techniques. We have now run over 200 randomized control trials, and you can see many of them at our results page on our website, and we'll put the link in the chat. So we know who these targets are. We know how to turn them from non-voters into new voters into consistent voters. The only things we're missing are volunteers and money. That's it. And again, you guys are here because you care about this stuff. So please start investing now, because these early elections are enormously efficient and cheap opportunities for us to start communicating with these voters. We'll put the donation link in the chat. Please click it and donate, or sign up for a monthly donation. You can click that box to say, make your donation monthly. Why is that important? Well, first of all, maybe you really want to support our work, but you want to spread it out over multiple months. But second, when you're in the business of building good voting habits, you have to communicate with voters all the time. And so our work is year-round work, and year-round work depends on year-round financial support. So please sign up for that monthly donation. If you ever want it to stop, all you need to do is reply to one of the receipts. We'll send you a receipt every month so you don't forget. A lot of organizations don't do that. We'll send you a receipt every month. All you have to do is reply and say, please cancel. We'll cancel it immediately and send you a receipt of the cancellation. Sign up, support our work. The third thing, host an online event. If you can get a bunch of your friends together to learn about the Environmental Voter Project, I will get on Zoom with them. Don't worry, I won't give them 19 states worth of data. Instead, we'll introduce them to how we identify voters, what our techniques are for turning them into new voters, some of our results, and then we can have a long Q&A session with them. It lasts an hour. We don't require people to donate. We just want you to call it a fundraiser. And then if people show up and they like what they see, we'll ask them for money. That's it. If this sounds interesting to you, if you want to get some of your friends on the Zoom to learn about our work at the Environmental Voter Project, email info@environmentalvoter.org. It doesn't need to be a long email. Just say, hey, I want more information about hosting an online event. And then finally, learn and spread the word. A few times tonight, we've mentioned that this is a very specific webinar. We were asked by a lot of people to go through all of the data on the voters we're going to be targeting this year. This is not an introduction to the Environmental Voter Project webinar. If you are interested in that, if you want to learn more about our work, how we identify voters, how we mobilize voters, what some of our results are, things like that, sign up for this February 8th introduction webinar. Even if you can't make it, sign up for it so that you'll get the recording of it after the fact. You can also, check out some of our mini briefings on our YouTube page. We'll put the link to that there as well. We have 7 to 10 minute briefings on a lot of different aspects of our work. All right, we made it. We made it in 59 minutes. We always like to keep to time here. Now, I realize that we just threw an enormous amount of information at you, as was advertised we would. But for those of you who want to stick around for the optional Q&A, please continue asking your questions in that Q&A folder, and Ren will throw them to me, or Peter will answer them. For those of you who want to leave, you can leave in 1 minute. You can leave in 1 minute, okay? But before you leave in that 1 minute, I just want to say, we are not going to get the next 9.5 months back. I'm sorry, I know you don't need people to make you more anxious right now, but we all know how crucially important this moment in time is. You are here for a reason. If being involved in our work is something that you think you could find value in, I want you to click on that link and sign up to volunteer. If you think that funding voter turnout work of these 4.8 million climate first voters is something that you want to support, please click that donation link. There's no limit on the amount you can donate. You can donate by credit card or check or wire or stock transfer. And we all know what happens when you log off a Zoom, right? You're like, oh my God, where did all those URLs go? So just like click on the link now and open it up. And for those of you who would like to leave, we will miss you, but thank you for sticking around for this really in-depth briefing. For the rest of you, again, please put any questions in that Q&A folder, and we will answer them now that we are in our optional Q&A session. So, Ren, what you got? What you got? What's the first question?
Yes, but before I give you the first question, I just
Yes.
want to take a moment to say thank you so much, everyone, for posting your questions in the Q&A box and for being so engaged. We really, really appreciate it. All right, Nathaniel, we have about 6 questions in queue, but don't worry, I will keep on looking at the Q&A section to ask more questions. But first, I think we have 2 questions from David. The first one is a good one. What can we do to help EVP do this important work? And can I ask the second question from David, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Second question is that for LPEV, what is the best estimate of the percentage you can convert to vote? Both from David H.
Really, really great questions, David. So first, what can you do to help? I love that question. We really like getting early contacts with these voters. And so obviously the simple answer to your question is volunteer and donate. That's how you can help. Volunteer and donate, volunteer and donate, volunteer and donate. But the earlier you volunteer and the earlier you donate, the better. And here's why. It's not just for budgeting purposes and things like that. It's because, one, multiple studies have shown that voting is a habit-forming behavior. And so the earlier we can talk to these voters and try to get them to the polls for their local elections or their presidential primaries or their state primaries, well, then the more likely they'll vote again in November. But it's cheaper to talk to them now because there's much less static out there. It's a lot easier to get through to them. And so that's the first reason why early volunteering and early donating is so important. The second reason is this. And those of you who have been on previous webinars might grin at this because you know that I love to talk about the importance of voter files, but they're far more important than most people realize. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record what elections you cast a ballot in and what elections you skip. Now, why am I bringing that up in this context to answer David's question? Because if we are able to get one of these low propensity environmental voters to vote in a March presidential primary or a May state primary, well, then it only takes a few months for the record of them having voted to show up on these public voter files. And then everybody who's running for Congress or governor or Senate or president, their campaigns see this and they say, holy moly, you know, Marianne Smith, that super environmentalist, just voted for the first time. Let's go get her. Let's send a canvasser to her door to make sure she votes for the right person. Let's figure out what issues she cares about. Oh, she cares about the environment. Let's make sure she knows who the environmental candidates are. So by getting your volunteer time and your donations in early, you then let us get these people to the polls early. And then it's like there's a bright red beacon next to their name in the public voter files saying, hey, look at me. I'm now a first-class citizen who votes. This is the easier, more efficient way to dramatically boost turnout this fall. To get to the second part of your question, David, what can we expect sort of the return to be? How much can we expect to boost turnout of these low propensity environmental voters? Well, not to be squirrely here, but it depends. It depends on how much money we've got to spend. Certainly, if all we can do in a particular election is make some calls and send one mail piece, the impact is going to be far less than what we can do if we can make a lot of calls, send multiple mail pieces, have a sophisticated digital ad campaign, talk to them during some early elections, also send postcards and things like that. It's going to be very, very different. Moreover, if you look at all the results on our website, I want to be very clear. It's easier to increase turnout in low turnout elections than it is in high turnout elections. So you'll look at our website and you'll see some things like, oh, they boost turnout 5 percentage points in a local election. That's not going to happen in a presidential general. You're lucky in a presidential general if you are able to boost turnout 1.5, 1.8 percentage points over your control group. And so we hope, if we are able to spend aggressively and have really big volunteer efforts, that in certain states we might be able to boost turnout at that 1.5, 1.8 percentage points over our control group level. And just to be clear, when I say that, what I mean by that is we would be solely responsible for boosting turnout that much among our targets when compared to a control group. So obviously, we're not going to be responsible for increasing turnout among all Pennsylvanians 1.5 percentage points. It would be among the low propensity environmental voters we're targeting. But that's a big number in this business. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.5% is in Pennsylvania, and he'll tell you. Those can be big, big numbers. And that's what we would hope for. That's what we would expect if fully funded and having enough volunteers, and also being able to talk to some of these people early. Great, great question, David. Questions, David.
Thanks, Nathaniel. The second one will come from Margaret B. Margaret asks, are phone banking and postcarding equally effective?
Wow, great question, Margaret. So I'm going to answer it, but I'm going to expand it a little bit. At the Environmental Voter Project, we like to measure both the effectiveness of various interventions and the efficiency. So just so you know what I mean by those two words in this context, let me explain, and then I'll go and answer your question. By effectiveness, what we mean is, okay, by how much can we boost turnout? Kind of like what David just asked. By how much can we boost turnout with this particular intervention? By efficiency, we mean, okay, well, maybe we can boost turnout that much, but how much volunteer time does it take? How expensive is it, right? Because if one thing boosts turnout 1 percentage point, but it costs $10 million, and another thing boosts turnout 0.5 percentage points, but it costs $10,000, well, one of them is more effective and the other is more efficient. And so we measure both of those. Okay, you asked about calling and postcarding. Calling, well, first of all, I will say, if you go to the results tab on our website and scroll to the bottom, you will see a whole bunch of studies of ours proving in randomized control trials that, at least with the messaging that we use, both calling and postcarding has been shown to increase turnout with statistically significant results. So we have multiple times been able to prove that our phone banks increase turnout and our postcards increase turnout. So they both work. Which is more effective? Postcards have a higher ceiling. They are more effective. I have not seen a phone bank boost turnout more than, I believe, 1 or 1.1 percentage points in like local and state primary elections. Whereas there, I believe, I'm getting the numbers correctly, have been some postcarding campaigns that have boosted turnout as much as 1.5 percentage points. So postcards have a higher ceiling. They're more effective, usually. Which is more efficient? Calling. Calling. You can reach more voters in less time for significantly less money calling than you can postcard. So that's the answer to your question, Margaret. But you didn't ask this, but I'm going to add a coda. I'm going to add an addendum here to your question, Margaret. We need to do both. We need to do both. And here's why. First of all, there are many people who don't have deliverable addresses. We can't confirm their post office addresses. Some of them because they just move around all the time, but also others because they literally don't have a post office address. For instance, there are a lot of people who live on Native American reservations who do not have post office addresses. So we need to call them. Also, there are some people for whom we don't have phone numbers, so it's really important to mail them. But perhaps most importantly is that so many of these interventions are cumulative, where if you postcard and phone call, the results are not just a little bit better, it's almost as though you're adding them on top of each other. And so it's so important to do all of these things and not just do one or just do the other. But really, really good question, Margaret. And I'm sure it's something that a lot of people are curious about.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Our next one comes from Marcus B. In what state and local elections do you see debates over climate and environmental issues?
Wow, great question, Marcus. I mean, the true but really uh, uh, unsatisfying answer is all of them. But certainly there are some states where very few elections are discussing climate, and there are other states where lots of elections are discussing climate. So let me go through a few of the ones that I see coming up over the next 9.5 months, Marcus, where I think climate will be a particularly salient issue. Alaska. The Alaska at-large congressional race had a lot of discussion about fisheries management and mining and climate change last time around, and it's gonna happen again. It's going to be a big issue there, period. Period. End of story. Second one, I imagine that Arizona always has a greater number of people caring about climate than other sort of swing states of the sort of same partisan makeup. But with the likely like scorching hot summer we're going to have, the growing water problems that Arizona is having, it's going to be a more salient issue, not just on the federal level, but remember what I showed on that slide, the state House of Representatives and the state Senate is super close in Arizona as well. And this is a really important state issue. Who has access to building permits and things like that? Can you build a house before even knowing whether you're going to have water coming to the house? Things like that. Arizona is definitely going to be a big deal. There's definitely going to be a lot of discussion of climate stuff. Certainly in Nebraska and Georgia, in those Public Service Commission and Public Utility Board races, where these are regulatory bodies that often own coal-fired power plants. You better believe there are going to be a lot of debates in those races talking about climate issues. Absolutely. And then the final thing I'll just mention, on both sides of the aisle, there are people running for Senate in Utah who are trying to center their campaign around climate change, a Republican and a Democrat. Now, you can fairly argue that the Republican isn't as good on climate issues as perhaps some people might like, but it's really interesting that both a Democrat, Caroline Gleick, who full disclosure, has run a phone bank for EVP before, and a Republican are running, trying to talk about climate change a lot. Do I think that's going to be a big, important, salient issue in that Senate race? I don't know. I don't know. But I tend to think that politicians are doing things for good reasons because they see things in data. And like I find it hard to believe that their campaigns are telling them, oh dear God, don't talk about that issue. That's suicide. No, I think they're being told by a lot of people, yeah, you might have a path to victory talking about this. So those are just a few examples, Marcus, of some things that I'm seeing.
Thanks, Nathaniel. The next one is coming from Brett. What are the top barriers preventing LPEV folks from voting?
Great question, Brett. So, as many of you probably noticed, there were some trends in a lot of the demographic data that in all of our state-specific breakdowns. These low propensity environmental voters were pretty consistently disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, and although it wasn't in there, I can tell you they're also disproportionately lower income. What do those three groups have in common? Lower income people, young people, and people of color. They all vote less often than the overall population. And by and large, they vote less often because, it's not the only reason, but because they are the object of voter suppression efforts. I mean, if you find any local or state or federal entity, usually it's local or state entities, trying to make it harder for someone to vote, they are either targeting young people, poor people, or people of color. That's it. And that is the beating heart of the modern environmental movement right there. Now, I'm not claiming that these elections officials are like twirling their mustaches saying like, oh, let's make it harder for those environmentalists to vote. No, they probably don't know that they are targeting environmentalists with their voter suppression efforts, but they are. They are. And so, Brett, one of the biggest barriers to these low propensity environmental voters voting are logistical suppression issues. Makes it hard for them to vote in certain times. They have to travel long distances to get to their polling places. You probably noticed that in Nebraska and Arizona and New Mexico and Alaska, we have significant numbers of Native American voters in our target populations. Well, oftentimes, they'll have to travel 30, 45, maybe even 60 minutes just to get to a polling place. And there's no way to describe that other than as voter suppression. It is voter suppression. And so that's a big barrier. Now, we at the Environmental Voter Project are not a litigation shop. We're not going to be taking entities to court to try to change their voter access laws. But one of the most effective ways that you can fight voter suppression is by teaching people how to vote, getting them early, walking them through the logistics of what they need to vote, how they can vote, the easiest ways for them to vote. Especially many of these low propensity environmental voters, if they have voted before, it hasn't been since 2018, 2019, like before COVID. It's a whole new world now. They might not know that they're getting a ballot mailed to them. They might not know about early voting. And so a lot of the ways that we, and I use we broadly, like volunteers, donors can help overcome voter suppression is not just through the court system, which is important, but also by teaching people how to vote. A lot of folks are just scared because they think voting is a lot harder than it actually is because they've been told that it's really hard, which is yet another version of voter suppression. Great, great question, Brett.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks, Nathaniel. This one is from an Anon. Does EVP's work make a difference in getting the more climate-friendly candidates to win in primaries, open close parentheses, of either party?
Great, great question. So yes. There have been peer-reviewed journals. Our staff might not have a link to this particular one, but if you're interested, please email info@environmentalvoter.org and we can send you the links. But there have been peer-reviewed journal articles that show candidates are more responsive to the priorities of voters than they are of non-voters. which is intuitive, right? But it's important to test these things. It's important to test these things. So yes, we do know that if you get more environmentalists to vote, and we have the proof of that on our results page, that politicians will then respond by being more likely to prioritize the values and priorities of those voters. So yes, we do know that happens. As far as can we claim that we're responsible for electing particular candidates? Well, no, no one can. No one can. Any organization that says we elected X is being somewhat misleading. Why? Why can't we claim that? Why can nobody claim that? Because who you vote for is secret. No one knows. We can tell you how many new voters we've created. We can tell you how many of the people we targeted voted. We can compare that to a control group and isolate what we were solely responsible for. We can tell you all of that with a precision that almost no other organizations can. But when it comes to who they voted for, no one can tell you that. But what we can say is this: these people we are mobilizing list climate and other environmental issues as their literal number one priority over all other issues. These are not people who kind of sort of feel good about climate change, but when they go in to vote, they're going to be thinking about this issue or that issue or another issue. No, 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 no. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. And we feel very, very comfortable getting those people to the polls. We also feel very, very comfortable knowing that this will not just change who wins and loses and what policy is made in general elections, but to the last part of your question, this is going to change what happens in Democratic and Republican primaries. And this goes back to the very, very beginning, when I went through that four-step process of what we do at EVP: identification, mobilization, habit reinforcement, and then the last one was change the electorate. Politicians go where the votes are, folks. They go where the votes are. And so when there is a Republican primary, when there is a Democratic primary, those candidates look at people who are likely to vote. They figure out what issues they care about and what messages will move them. And all they then care about is winning that election. And so if we can change the demand in that marketplace, if we can get more environmentalists to vote in primaries, yes, the politicians will follow, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but rather because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing elections. Politicians go where the votes are. And I think this is so crucially important to understand, and I'm so glad this question was asked, because oftentimes we think about the importance of mobilizing voters like this so that it can impact a particular election and a particular candidate can win. And I'm not going to downplay the importance of that. Of course, it's important who wins and loses elections. Of course it is. But even when the so-called right person wins, it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want done. We all know that all too well. No, they need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on. And I'm sorry, but no politician, no matter how good they are, no matter how environmentally friendly they are, none of them, after they get elected, are going to say, oh, okay, let's now spend all our political capital on this thing that 2% of voters care about. No way. They have to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on. And they ain't going to spend it on all the things that non-voters care about. They're going to spend it on the things that voters care most about. And that's why it's so important in Democratic primaries, in Republican primaries, in purple states, in blue states, in red states, to build up that demand in the political marketplace. Not because I'm under the illusion that we can turn every politician into a climate leader. Of course we can. But what we can do is we can make it consistently harder and harder and harder for anybody to run for office without worrying about these climate voters. And when we can do that, then not only will we elect more of the right leaders, but when they are elected, they will then become more likely to spend their political capital leading on climate. That's how we not only start turning some of our opponents, but it's how we support our allies.
Thanks, Nathaniel. And shout out to Peter for holding down the Q&A section. We have about 4 minutes. So Nathaniel, I'm going to ask the last two questions, which I think is a good way to end tonight's event. The first one is from Glenn. What are your main sources of funding? And then if I may, can I ask the second one? It's from Francis. The last one is that how can someone increase a monthly donation?
Outstanding questions. So, Glenn, we are what's called a 501c4 nonprofit. So we are a nonprofit, but we are a 501c4 nonprofit. That means that most foundations cannot support us. So when you ask our sources of funding, it is 98% individuals. We had over 7,000 individual donors last year. I think the average donation was something like $50. So, not Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren numbers, but still 7,000 individual donors. That's pretty darn good. And so, and then the remaining, not the 98% is there are a few what's called public charities that can support us. And so we did get some money from them. But that's how we get our funding from individuals like you, from people like you. We have people donating $10. We have people donating $300,000. That's how we get our funding. And Francis, to answer your question, there are two ways to change a recurring monthly donation. One is to just email us at info@environmentalvoter.org, say that you want to change it, and one of our staff members will give you a call and get the information from you. Or you can just say, hey, change it from $50 to $60. And as long as we have an email from you asking that, we'll go ahead and change it for you. Okay. That's the first way you can do it. The second way is you can just sign up. You can just sign up for a new monthly donation at this new amount and then email us and ask us to cancel the old one. We're very responsive on this. So those are the two ways to do it. You can just email us and say new amount, or sign up for a new one and we'll cancel the old one. The reason we don't have a link for you to do it on our website, to go in, access your recurring donation and change the amount, is there are a few merchant banks, not a lot, but a few that claim there is no secure way to do that. And so I'm not smart enough on these issues to know whether to trust them or not, but I know I'm going to lean towards trying to create the most secure environment for our donors possible. So we don't have a link on our website that you can go in and change your amount yourself. So those are the two ways to do it. Okay. I can't believe so many of you stayed on for what is now almost an hour and a half. You're crazy, but we love you. So I'm just going to close with this. First is you can now see in the chat the Get Involved link. It's been there a whole bunch. Please click it. Sign up to volunteer. We've got 9.5 months left. And as I said to a few people's questions, getting involved early, I believe it was David's questions, getting involved early is so, so important. It can have a much, much bigger impact. And then the final thing is donate. Donate. Donate as much as you can. Not because you're doing us a favor. I don't want you to think of us as a charity. I want you to do it as an investment. You're here for a reason, because you care about the climate crisis. You care about the democracy crisis, and you recognize that the next 9.5 months are a special moment in time where so much good could happen, or let's be honest, so much bad could happen. We know who our targets are. We have proven results. We just need the volunteers and donations to make it happen. So thank you all. Thank you all so, so much. If you'd like a recording of this, just watch your email tomorrow night. And we are all incredibly grateful that you shared your evening with us. Take care.